In a quiet little neighborhood tucked away near the edge of a sprawling national wildlife preserve, life moved at a peaceful pace. The houses were neat, the streets were clean, and the air carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. For Sarah Thompson, this place was more than just a house. It was her sanctuary. Her home stood out not because it was bigger or fancier than the others, but because of its backyard. Towering sugar maple trees stretched toward the sky, their branches creating a natural canopy that shaded her property year-round. These weren't ordinary trees. They had been growing there for decades, long before any of the houses were built. They attracted songbirds, provided cool shade during summer afternoons, and gave Sarah's yard a magical feel. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared Sarah's love for her trees. Karen Peterson, the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, saw them differently. Karen was known as someone who liked everything to look perfect: manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and clear views of the surrounding landscape. She often talked about upgrading the neighborhood to make it more modern and attractive. To her, Sarah's trees were messy, old-fashioned, and worst of all, an obstruction. Some of the neighbors agreed with her, saying the trees blocked the beautiful view of the hills behind Sarah's property. Others didn't care much either way. They just wanted peace and quiet. At first, Karen tried to handle things politely. During HOA meetings, she brought up the topic of tree management, suggesting that certain trees might need trimming or even removal to improve the overall appearance of the area. Sarah listened patiently, but always shook her head. Those trees meant too much to her. And besides, she knew something Karen didn't. Those towering maples weren't just part of her backyard. Because of their location near the wildlife preserve, they were protected by federal laws designed to safeguard native plants and ecosystems. Cutting them down without permission could lead to serious consequences. Despite Sarah's explanations, Karen wouldn't let it go. She argued that rules were meant to be bent if they improved the community. "It's not personal," Karen would say with a tight smile. "It's about making sure our neighborhood looks its best." But to Sarah, it felt deeply personal. Those trees weren't just trees. They were memories. She remembered climbing them as a child when her family visited this very spot years ago. Now, as an adult living in her dream home, she couldn't imagine her yard without them. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Neighbors whispered about the growing rift between Sarah and Karen. Some thought Sarah was being stubborn, while others admired her determination to stand up for what she believed in. Karen, on the other hand, grew increasingly frustrated. In her mind, she was doing what was best for everyone. Why couldn't Sarah see that? Little did anyone know, this disagreement was about to spiral into something far bigger and far more dramatic than anyone could have predicted. As days turned into weeks, the calm of the neighborhood began to crack, setting the stage for a showdown no one saw coming. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze and the sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, Sarah found an envelope tucked into her mailbox. At first glance, it looked like another routine notice from the HOA, perhaps a reminder about lawn maintenance or holiday decorations. But when she opened it, her heart sank. The letter was formal, cold, and direct. It demanded that Sarah trim back, or completely remove, several of her beloved sugar maple trees. The reason? According to Karen, these trees were obstructing scenic views for neighboring homes and violating vague aesthetic guidelines set by the HOA. Sarah stared at the paper, disbelief washing over her. How could something so trivial outweigh the beauty and importance of those towering giants? She thought about all the mornings she'd spent sipping coffee under their shade, listening to birds chirp as sunlight filtered through the leaves. To her, they weren't just trees. They were living pieces of history, part of what made her home special. And now, someone wanted them gone because they blocked a view. Determined not to let this slide, Sarah decided to fight back, but calmly and respectfully. She sat down at her kitchen table, penning a thoughtful response to the HOA. In her letter, she explained that the trees weren't just part of her property. They were protected by federal conservation laws due to their proximity to the nearby wildlife preserve. She included copies of official documents from local environmental agencies, clearly stating that cutting down or even trimming these trees without proper authorization could result in hefty fines, and worse, harm to the ecosystem. When Karen received Sarah's reply, she barely glanced at the attachments before setting them aside. During the next HOA meeting, she dismissed Sarah's concerns with a wave of her hand. "Rules are rules," Karen said firmly, addressing the group. "If we don't enforce our guidelines, how will anyone take us seriously? Besides, I'm sure there's some way around this so-called protection." Her tone implied that Sarah was exaggerating or using technicalities to avoid cooperation. As word spread through the neighborhood, opinions began to divide. Some residents sympathized with Sarah, agreeing that the trees added charm and character to the area. Others sided with Karen, grumbling that Sarah was being unreasonable and selfish. "It's not like she owns the whole neighborhood," one neighbor muttered during a casual chat outside the community pool. Another chimed in, "I mean, come on. A little trimming wouldn't hurt anyone." Despite the growing tension, Sarah remained hopeful that reason would prevail. After all, the law was on her side, or so she believed. She continued to politely remind Karen and the HOA board about the legal protections, hoping they'd see sense. But Karen seemed unmoved, brushing off each mention of federal regulations as if they were minor inconveniences rather than binding laws. What Sarah didn't realize was that Karen's determination ran deeper than mere aesthetics. For Karen, this wasn't just about improving property values or creating better views. It was about control. She prided herself on running a tight ship, ensuring every detail in the neighborhood aligned with her vision of perfection. And Sarah's refusal to comply felt like a personal challenge to her authority. As weeks passed, the standoff grew more intense. Neighbors stopped chatting casually at mailboxes, afraid of accidentally reigniting the debate. Meanwhile, Karen started dropping hints that if Sarah didn't act soon, the HOA might have no choice but to take matters into its own hands. Though she never explicitly threatened anything drastic, her words carried an undertone of warning. For Sarah, the situation felt surreal. What had once been a peaceful, close-knit community now felt fractured, with neighbors taking sides and tensions simmering beneath the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that something big, and possibly irreversible, was looming on the horizon. Little did she know, Karen's patience was wearing thin, and her next move would leave everyone reeling. With the dust of controversy beginning to settle, the neighborhood embarked on a journey of restoration, not just for Sarah's yard, but for its fractured sense of community. Facing mounting pressure from authorities and residents alike, Karen agreed to shoulder the financial burden of her actions. She paid hefty fines levied by federal agencies and covered the cost of replanting native species in Sarah's backyard. It was a small step toward making amends, but it signaled a willingness to take responsibility. Sarah, determined to turn this tragedy into something positive, worked closely with environmental experts to restore her property. The goal wasn't simply to replace what had been lost. It was to create an even better habitat for wildlife, while educating others about the importance of conservation. Native saplings, carefully chosen for their resilience and ecological value, were planted in place of the fallen maples. Birdhouses and bat boxes dotted the perimeter, inviting creatures back to the space that once thrived under the old tree shade. Slowly, life began returning to Sarah's yard. Chirping sparrows, fluttering butterflies, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. The project drew attention far beyond the neighborhood. Donations poured in from across the country, sent by people inspired by Sarah's fight against injustice. Some contributed money, while others offered resources like seeds, tools, or expertise. A local nursery donated dozens of young trees, and volunteers arrived on weekends to help with planting and cleanup efforts. What started as a personal loss transformed into a community-wide initiative, bringing neighbors together in ways no one had anticipated. Meanwhile, the HOA underwent significant changes. Under new leadership, the organization implemented stricter policies requiring all landscaping decisions to be reviewed by environmental consultants. Gone were the days of hasty rulings based solely on aesthetics. Now, every proposal had to consider its impact on the ecosystem. Educational workshops became a regular feature of HOA meetings, teaching residents about sustainable practices and the legal protections surrounding natural habitats. Karen herself played a key role in organizing these sessions, using her newfound knowledge to guide others. Though some still viewed her with skepticism, many appreciated her efforts to prevent similar mistakes in the future. As months passed, the neighborhood began to feel different. Not perfect, but hopeful. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now chatted over garden fences, bonding over shared goals of sustainability and harmony. Children learned about ecosystems in school projects inspired by Sarah's story, and families gathered for tree planting events that doubled as block parties. Even the media took notice, shifting their narrative from scandal to recovery. Stories highlighted the community's resilience and commitment to rebuilding, not just physically but socially. For Sarah, the transformation brought a bittersweet kind of peace. While nothing could fully replace the towering maples she'd loved so dearly, the new growth gave her hope. Watching tiny saplings stretch toward the sky reminded her that healing takes time, and that sometimes beauty arises from pain. She often found herself sitting on her porch, sipping tea and marveling at how much had changed since that fateful night when chainsaws shattered the quiet. Karen, too, experienced a quiet kind of redemption. Though she would likely never regain her former standing in the community, she found solace in contributing to its renewal. Her mornings were spent tending to her own garden, which she filled with pollinator-friendly plants and wildflowers. In the evenings, she joined Sarah for walks around the neighborhood, pointing out signs of progress. A newly planted oak here, a family of bluebirds nesting there. Their relationship, once adversarial, evolved into an uneasy friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. But perhaps the most profound change was within the neighborhood itself. What had once been a collection of individual homes became something greater, a cohesive community united by a common goal. The scars of the past remained visible, etched into memories and landscapes alike, but they served as reminders of lessons learned. And as the seasons cycled through autumn's golds and spring's greens, the neighborhood stood as proof that even the deepest wounds can heal with care, patience, and collective effort. Weeks turned into months, and the tension between Sarah and Karen showed no signs of easing. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah continued going about her daily life, trying to focus on work, her garden, and the simple joys of living in such a beautiful place. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Every time she saw Karen walking her dog or chatting with neighbors, she wondered if the HOA president was plotting something behind the scenes. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late autumn, and the air carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach. Sarah had just finished dinner and was settling onto the couch with a book when she heard it, a sharp, jarring buzz slicing through the quiet evening. At first, she thought it might be construction noise from a distant part of town, but as the sound grew louder, her heart began to race. Chainsaws. Someone was using chainsaws near her home. Throwing on her robe, Sarah rushed outside, her bare feet crunching against the frosty grass. What she saw made her blood run cold. Two men stood in her backyard, wielding buzzing chainsaws as they hacked away at her beloved sugar maples. Splinters flew, branches crashed to the ground, and the once majestic trees groaned under the assault. Her mouth dropped open in shock, and for a moment she could only stare, unable to process what was happening. "What are you doing?" she finally shouted, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. The workers paused, turning to look at her with blank expressions. One of them shrugged and said, "Just following orders, Mom." "Whose orders?" Sarah demanded, though deep down, she already knew the answer. The worker hesitated before replying. "Miss Peterson. She hired us to clear these trees." Sarah felt like the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Karen had gone too far this time, far beyond anything reasonable or ethical. How could someone claim authority over another person's property, let alone destroy trees protected by federal law? It didn't make sense. Was this some kind of power trip, a desperate attempt to assert control, or simply ignorance of the consequences? Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some looked horrified, while others watched silently, unsure of what to say. A few even nodded approvingly, whispering things like, "Well, maybe it'll open up the view," or "She should have done this ages ago." Sarah felt completely alone, standing amidst the chaos, watching her sanctuary being torn apart. By sunrise, the damage was done. Where towering trees once stood, jagged stumps remained, surrounded by piles of broken branches and scattered leaves. Sarah wandered through the wreckage, tears streaming down her face. Each fallen tree felt like a piece of her soul had been ripped away. This wasn't just an attack on her property. It was an attack on her way of life, her memories, and her connection to nature. Fueled by a mix of grief and fury, Sarah called the police. When officers arrived, she explained the situation, showing them the documents proving the tree's protected status. They listened intently, their faces growing darker with each detail. Cutting down federally protected trees was no small offense. It carried serious legal repercussions, including hefty fines and potential criminal charges. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously stayed neutral now found themselves questioning whether Karen had crossed a line. Even those who supported her vision for the community began to feel uneasy. Had she acted out of spite, arrogance, or sheer disregard for the rules? Karen, meanwhile, appeared unfazed when confronted later that day. Standing on her porch, arms crossed, she insisted she hadn't known about the federal protections. "I was just trying to do what's best for the neighborhood," she said defensively. "If I'd known there were laws involved, I wouldn't have done it." But Sarah wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Something about Karen's tone, the casual dismissal, the lack of remorse, told her this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Whatever Karen's intentions, the damage was done, and there was no undoing it. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the ruined yard, Sarah realized this fight was far from over. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. Very wrong. Karen's journey toward redemption wasn't quick or easy, but it was genuine. Over time, she became a different person. Not the controlling, rule-obsessed leader who had once dominated HOA meetings, but someone humbled by her mistakes and eager to make a difference. Her transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't without its challenges. Neighbors still whispered about her behind closed doors, and some refused to forgive her entirely. But Karen didn't let that stop her. Instead, she poured her energy into rebuilding trust, one small step at a time. One of her biggest initiatives was spearheading the creation of Nature Walks, a series of guided tours through the neighborhood designed to educate residents about the local ecosystem. These walks highlighted the importance of native plants, discussed the role of pollinators like bees and butterflies, and explained how even small actions, like planting a single tree, could have a lasting impact. Karen led many of these tours herself, armed with a clipboard and newfound knowledge. At first, attendance was sparse, with only a handful of curious neighbors showing up. But as word spread about how informative and engaging the walks were, more people began joining in, including families with children. Sarah played an active role in supporting Karen's efforts. Together, they collaborated on projects that blended education with action. For example, they organized a community green day, where residents came together to plant trees, clean up litter, and learn about sustainable gardening practices. Local businesses donated refreshments, and volunteers brought music and games, turning the event into a celebration of renewal. It was during moments like these that Sarah noticed a shift, not just in Karen, but in the entire neighborhood. People laughed together, worked side by side, and shared stories over picnic blankets, The tension that had once divided them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and camaraderie. Karen also started writing a monthly column for the HOA newsletter, titled Lessons from the Land. In it, she shared insights about conservation, recounted her own missteps, and encouraged others to think critically about their impact on the environment. Her tone was honest and self-deprecating, often poking fun at her past behavior while emphasizing the importance of learning from mistakes. Readers responded positively, praising her vulnerability and dedication to change. One neighbor even joked, "If Karen can admit she was wrong, maybe there's hope for all of us." Despite her progress, Karen knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily or universally. Some neighbors remained distant, their resentment lingering like storm clouds on the horizon. She accepted this, understanding that earning back trust required patience and consistency. On days when doubts crept in, she reminded herself why she was doing this, not for validation, but because it was the right thing to do. Her quiet determination earned her grudging respect from even her harshest critics. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. The saplings planted in Sarah's yard grew taller, their slender trunks reaching skyward. Birds returned, nesting in the branches and filling the air with song. Wildflowers bloomed along walkways, attracting bees and butterflies. The scars left by the chainsaws began to fade, replaced by signs of new life. For Karen, seeing this progress was deeply rewarding. It reminded her that healing, whether of land or relationships, takes time, effort, and care. By the end of the year, Karen had become an unlikely advocate for environmental stewardship. Once infamous for cutting down protected trees, she was now celebrated for championing their preservation. Her story served as a powerful reminder that people can change, even after making grave mistakes. And though she would always carry the weight of her past decisions, she found peace in knowing she was using her experience to help others avoid similar pitfalls. For Sarah, watching Karen evolve from adversary to ally was both surprising and heartening. It reinforced her belief in second chances and in the power of community to overcome conflict. As they stood together one crisp autumn morning, admiring the golden hues of newly planted trees, Sarah realized something profound. Sometimes, growth isn't just about trees stretching toward the sun. It's also about hearts opening wide enough to embrace forgiveness, resilience, and hope. The media frenzy surrounding the tree-cutting incident reached a fever pitch, and Karen became the face of everything people love to hate about overzealous HOA leaders. Memes mocking her circulated endlessly online, with captions like, "When you think your view is more important than federal law," or "How to ruin a neighborhood in 3 easy steps." Late-night comedians cracked jokes about her at the expense of her reputation. For someone who had always thrived on control and perfection, this public humiliation was unbearable. At first, Karen tried to fight back. She gave interviews, insisting she hadn't known about the federal protections, and framing herself as a well-meaning but misunderstood figure. "I'm not some villain," she told one reporter, her voice wavering between defiance and desperation. "I just wanted to make our community better." But her words fell flat when emails surfaced showing she'd been warned repeatedly by Sarah and local environmental agencies. One email, in particular, stood out. It explicitly stated that cutting down the trees could result in legal action under multiple conservation laws. The evidence painted a clear picture. Karen had ignored warnings and plowed ahead anyway. As the backlash intensified, Karen retreated from public life. She stopped attending HOA meetings, avoided neighbors, and kept her curtains drawn tight against prying eyes. Her once immaculate yard grew untended, weeds creeping through cracks in the driveway. It was as if the weight of her mistakes had crushed her spirit entirely. Yet, despite her efforts to disappear, reminders of her actions were everywhere. Every time she ventured out for groceries or a walk, someone would glare at her or whisper behind her back. For Sarah, watching Karen crumble brought mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. After all, Karen's reckless behavior had caused irreversible damage to her property and the environment. But another part of her couldn't help feeling sorry for the woman. No one deserved to be humiliated so publicly, no matter how wrong they'd been. As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself reflecting on the situation. Was there any way forward? Could forgiveness play a role in healing not only Karen but also the fractured neighborhood? One chilly morning, Sarah received an unexpected knock at her door. Standing on her porch was Karen, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever before. Gone was the confident, polished woman who had once dominated HOA meetings. In her place was someone visibly broken. Without waiting for an invitation, Karen blurted out an apology. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now how wrong I was." Sarah hesitated, caught off guard by the raw emotion in Karen's voice. She didn't respond immediately, instead inviting Karen inside to sit down. Over cups of tea, Karen opened up about the pressure she'd felt to keep the neighborhood perfect, the fear of losing control, and the shame of realizing she'd gone too far. For the first time, Sarah saw Karen not as an adversary, but as a flawed human being capable of remorse. Though skeptical, Sarah decided to give Karen a chance. Together, they brainstormed ways to make amends, not just to Sarah, but to the entire community. They agreed to collaborate on a project aimed at educating residents about the importance of preserving native trees and wildlife. Informational plaques would be installed throughout the neighborhood, highlighting the ecological significance of the area. Karen even volunteered to lead workshops, sharing what she'd learned about conservation laws and sustainable practices. Slowly, opinions began to shift. Neighbors who had written Karen off as irredeemable started to soften their stance, impressed by her willingness to take responsibility. While trust wouldn't return overnight, her genuine efforts earned her a measure of forgiveness. For Sarah, seeing Karen transform from antagonist to ally was both surprising and heartening. It reminded her that growth often comes from pain, and that even those who make grave mistakes can find redemption. But the journey wasn't over yet. Restoring the neighborhood's harmony would require more than apologies and goodwill gestures. Real change would take time, effort, and commitment from everyone involved. And though Karen had taken the first step toward rebuilding her reputation, the scars of the past would linger, serving as a reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation. Years later, the neighborhood had transformed into something no one could have predicted during those tense, divisive days. What had once been a fractured community marked by conflict and mistrust was now a thriving haven of harmony and shared purpose. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared entirely. Old stumps still dotted Sarah's yard, serving as quiet reminders of what had been lost. But they were overshadowed by new growth, both literal and metaphorical. The towering saplings that now stood in place of the fallen maples swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling with the promise of renewal. Karen's role in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically. Once feared and resented, she became a beloved figure known for her tireless dedication to environmental causes. Her monthly column, Lessons from the Land, grew so popular that it was picked up by a regional magazine, inspiring readers far beyond the confines of the subdivision. She often joked about how ironic it was that someone who once cut down trees now spent her days planting them. But there was no bitterness in her tone, only gratitude for the opportunity to make amends. Sarah, too, found herself at peace. Her backyard, once a source of heartache, had become a sanctuary not just for her but for the entire community. Families brought their children to marvel at the pollinator garden buzzing with bees and butterflies. Birdwatchers gathered on crisp mornings, binoculars in hand, to spot hawks circling overhead or chickadees flitting among the branches. Even neighbors who had sided with Karen during the dispute came around, admitting that the changes had made the area more beautiful and more meaningful than ever before. The HOA evolved into an organization focused less on rigid rules and more on fostering connection and sustainability. Monthly meetings included discussions about conservation efforts, updates on local wildlife sightings, and plans for future projects like rain gardens and solar panel installations. New families moving into the neighborhood were greeted warmly, handed packets filled with tips for eco-friendly living, and invited to participate in ongoing initiatives. It was a far cry from the contentious gatherings of years past, where arguments over aesthetics dominated the agenda. For Karen and Sarah, their unlikely friendship became a cornerstone of the community's transformation. They often sat together on Sarah's porch, sipping coffee and reminiscing about how far they'd come since that fateful night when chainsaws shattered the quiet. Their bond wasn't without its complexities. There were moments when old tensions surfaced, reminders of wounds that hadn't fully healed, but it was rooted in mutual respect and a shared commitment to creating something better. One spring afternoon, the neighborhood held a special ceremony to dedicate a plaque installed near Sarah's property. Inscribed with words celebrating the resilience of nature and the power of community, it served as a lasting tribute to the lessons learned. As residents gathered around, Karen stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words carried weight. "We've all made mistakes," she said, looking out at the crowd. "But what matters is how we choose to move forward. This isn't just a story about trees. It's a story about coming together, learning, and growing." The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged, echoing through the streets lined with blossoming flowers and budding trees. Children ran barefoot across freshly mowed lawns, laughing as kites soared above their heads. Elderly neighbors exchanged stories on park benches, while teenagers organized cleanup drives along walking paths. The sense of unity was palpable, woven into every interaction and decision. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Sarah took a moment to reflect. She thought about the journey, the anger, the heartbreak, the reconciliation, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The trees may have been cut down, but they had planted seeds of change that would endure for generations. And though life would always bring challenges, she knew this community was stronger because of what they'd overcome together. In the end, the story wasn't just about protecting trees or punishing wrongdoing. It was about resilience, the kind that comes from standing firm in your beliefs, extending forgiveness when it feels impossible, and finding beauty in the process of rebuilding. For Sarah, Karen, and everyone else who called this place home, it was proof that even after the darkest storms, roots can grow deeper, branches can reach higher, and communities can flourish in ways no one ever imagined. The arrival of the police marked a turning point in the neighborhood's quiet existence. Officers examined the scene with grim expressions, their boots crunching over the debris of fallen branches and shattered stumps. Sarah stood nearby, clutching her folder of documents, her hands trembling as she recounted what had happened. The officers listened carefully, nodding as they flipped through the papers proving that the sugar maples were protected under federal conservation laws. When asked about Karen's involvement, Sarah explained how the HOA president had ignored repeated warnings and forged ahead with the destruction. One officer raised an eyebrow, jotting notes furiously. "Ma'am," he said finally, "this isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. Cutting down federally protected trees is a serious offense." News of the investigation spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had previously stayed on the sidelines began to whisper among themselves, torn between loyalty to Karen and disbelief at her actions. Some still defended her, insisting she must not have understood the gravity of the situation. "She's always cared about the community," one neighbor argued weakly during a tense sidewalk conversation. But others weren't so forgiving. "Ignorance isn't an excuse," snapped another. "You don't just cut down someone's trees because you don't like them." Karen, for her part, tried to play the role of the misunderstood leader. She called an emergency HOA meeting, hoping to rally support. Standing in front of a small crowd of residents, she spoke with practiced confidence. "I admit I made a mistake," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with frustration. "But my intentions were good. I wanted to improve our neighborhood, not break any laws." Her words might have carried weight if it weren't for the emails and messages uncovered later, evidence showing she'd been explicitly warned about the legal status of the trees multiple times. As the days passed, More details emerged, painting a damning picture. Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing Karen the HOA villain in attention-grabbing headlines. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, setting up cameras near Sarah's devastated yard and knocking on doors for interviews. Videos surfaced online of Karen dismissing Sarah's concerns at HOA meetings, her tone dismissive and condescending. Social media exploded with memes mocking her behavior, turning her into an overnight internet sensation. For all the wrong reasons. For Sarah, the whirlwind of attention was overwhelming. Strangers reached out to offer support, sharing stories of similar battles against overzealous HOAs or neighbors. Environmental groups praised her for standing up for nature, while lawyers specializing in conservation law volunteered their services. Donations poured in from across the country to help cover legal fees and replant the lost trees. What started as a personal tragedy transformed into a rallying cry for protecting natural spaces. Meanwhile, Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Once admired, or at least tolerated, for her take-charge attitude, she now faced hostility wherever she went. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and even her closest allies distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. At one point, she attempted to host a casual get-together at her home, only to find that no one showed up. The loneliness gnawed at her, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. Legal proceedings moved swiftly. Federal authorities stepped in, investigating the extent of the damage caused by cutting down the protected trees. They discovered that several migratory bird species had nested in the maples, making their destruction a violation of additional environmental protections. Facing mounting pressure, Karen resigned as HOA president, citing stress and personal reasons. It was a humiliating fall from grace for someone who had once prided herself on running a tight-knit community. Yet, amidst the chaos, seeds of change began to sprout. The HOA board scrambled to rebuild trust, implementing stricter guidelines for future landscaping decisions. Environmental experts were brought in to educate members about conservation laws and sustainable practices. Slowly, painfully, the neighborhood started moving toward healing, but scars remained, reminders of how quickly harmony could unravel when power went unchecked. Sarah, though heartbroken, refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for the environment. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized this was far bigger than her backyard. This was about preserving something irreplaceable for generations to come. And Karen, well, her story was far from over.